Okay, it's Mercedes miles ahead of the rest, and the rest is Mercedes. Well, the B team, you could call it now. That's last year's Mercedes, with Lance Stroll slightly quicker than Sergio Perez. Lewis Hamilton on the pole in terms of the factory team results. So let's analyse that first of all, because that will be an interesting race within a race. Mercedes will be starting on the yellow tyre, which means that they'll have a longer first stint than, say, Ferrari, so that's good for them. They've got everything perfect. A little bit of smoke coming out of the Merc engines at one point this morning, but nothing really I think that we should be worried about. A perfect lap again by Lewis Hamilton. I say perfect. There's no such thing as the perfect lap. I'm sure even Lewis would agree with that, but pretty near perfect. Valtteri Bottas only a tenth slower, which is exactly where he should be. I mean, he'll be very pleased, I think, with that result. If he thinks, why can't I beat Lewis? He will possibly look at data, he'll look at analysis of the onboard laps. But the reality is that it's not about line, even though Valtteri has this penchant for slightly longer corners. That's the feel he likes to have. He likes to be able to see a little bit more of the corner before he can commit to it. But it's not only that, it's also, as I keep using this word, manipulation. It's manipulation of the steering, the throttle, the brakes against one another. And when I say brakes, I mean coming out of the brake pedal pressure. And Valtteri did a lot of work early in his career with Rob Wilson on this, and he hasn't done much in the last 3 or 4 years, interestingly, which perhaps means that he's maybe got into a bad habit or two, or indeed plateauing out and not improving in a couple of areas where he could still go for it. But that's another subject. If you actually analyse the two laps, you can look at slight differences. You can look at Valtteri using a little bit of curb here, or perhaps running a little bit wider here. It's not about line, though. I'd be willing to bet anything that if you told Lewis to drive exactly the lap that Valtteri has driven in terms of its line, its geographical racing line, if you put white paint coming out of the back of Valtteri's car and then told Lewis to follow that lap, if such a thing was ever possible, Lewis would still do his pole lap. It's the way he manipulates the car within the racing line, the way he gets the rotation, the way he gets the change of direction. That is what it's all about. The inputs, the soft, slightly softer inputs that he's able to give the car. None of which, as I keep saying, is really visible on an onboard analysis or even a digital data analysis. And that's what these subtle differences that Rob Wilson can sometimes find in a driver's repertoire are all about. So to me, that was a Lewis Hamilton lap on a high downforce circuit where he can still impart just a little bit to be ahead of a driver as good as Valtteri Bottas. So that shows how good Lewis is. It's only a tenth, but against a driver like Valtteri in a car as good as the Mercedes, that is actually the right and significant amount for Lewis to have the pole by if he's doing his job to perfection. His job in general to perfection, which of course he does. So that's that. Then we look at Racing Point, who have a substantial advantage, as we said, after Austria. They are the second best. They have the second best car in Formula One at the moment. Obviously, that goes down the road in terms of the protests that Renault have against them. And the more weight they show, the more strength they have, I think the more the Renaults and the McLarens will be, and probably the Red Bulls now, will be thinking we've got to do something about this, or we've got to join the club, one of the two. As I keep saying, the solution is to go to customer cars, but that, again, sadly, is another subject at the moment. If we look at Racing Point, Lance Stroll, slightly quicker than Sergio Perez. Sergio is saying he's not feeling the best, slightly dizzy, which is quite worrying, actually, because dizziness is not something you want to feel in a Formula One car ever. I'm surprised he even got in the car if he is feeling genuinely dizzy. But having said that, a great lap by Lance Stroll. And guess what? Another Rob Wilson driver. He's been doing a lot of work with Rob over the last 2 or 3 years, even though they've been keeping it very quiet. The family don't like to talk about it. So we won't go into it too much, but believe me, Rob has been doing a lot in terms of rotation and the way Lance can get the platform of the car right so he can rotate it at exactly the right moment. And that is what we saw today in qualifying. The lap in Hungary, providing you've got a pretty good balance and a reasonably high grip level, is all about choosing the right moment for rotating the car, and that's exactly what Lance did to perfection. I think Sergio did his first lap. I think he lost because he ran a bit wide, which is to be expected if you're feeling a bit dizzy. Second lap, obviously, he was a little bit more conservative. This should be a circuit that's very good for Sergio because he is, as I've said several times, his main forte is his ability, sort of Jensen Button, Kimi Räikkönen at his peak forte of being able to load up the loaded rear on acceleration at exactly the right rate and never overload the rear tyres. So he'll be in good shape tomorrow in terms of preserving the tyres if that becomes a factor, even though they too will be starting on the yellow, the harder tyre, which is great for Racing Point. That's just an aside. But for Sergio Perez, he was relying, I think, as much on that as anything else. And it was Lance Stroll that was able to do a little bit more going into the corners to get the braking pretty much right in terms of coming out at the right rate, loading up the steering at the right rate, and then giving him this really nice rotation, which Sergio wasn't doing. His corners were going on a little bit longer, a little bit like Valtteri Bottas against Lewis Hamilton, and but he was great on exit. Whenever you looked at him, he never looked to be out of line. He looked really good on exit, but it wasn't enough to beat Lance Stroll, which is really significant, I think, on a circuit like that, in a car as good as that, with a lot of downforce. Lance Stroll has outqualified Sergio Perez, and that's really, really impressive. Another Canadian did very well today, and that was Nicholas Latifi, who got his Williams into Q2, like George Russell, who was ahead of him. But great performance by Nicholas Latifi as well, and George. But we've talked a lot about George, and we will talk a little bit more about him coming up. Then we have behind them the Ferraris. Now you could say, wow, both Ferraris made it into Q3, but we shouldn't be saying that because of course they should be in Q3. They just had a disaster in Austria. The car definitely is better in some areas, probably flattered by being able to just crank on wing for Hungary. To my eye, the car looks to be better at the back now, and I think that's where Sebastian Vettel is feeling he's got the confidence now to do what he does really well, which was to just go in deep into a corner, rotate the car relatively slow, minimum speed, and then get out of it. He can do that really well, as we've seen so often at Ferrari, and also before that at Red Bull in the first few years at Red Bull, and even at Toro Rosso. He's really, really good when the car does have grip at the rear, because it allows him to make that rotation. It sounds a bit counterintuitive. You'd think you'd want the front to be sticking if you want the rotation, but it's not that, it's the rear, because of course you can get the front in. It's a question of what you do with the rear, and if you've got a floaty rear, a light rear, an edgy rear, that's when Sebastian is always in trouble. And I think that's what they've cured at Ferrari. But in doing that, I think they're kind of nullifying what Charles Leclerc can bring to the table, which is his ability to manipulate the rear very, very subtly. Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, like with throttle, with steering. He doesn't have to do that now. He's got a good rear. What he doesn't have anymore is a great front, and he's got understeer, where before he could make the car pretty neutral, if not slightly oversteery. And that's why Charles Leclerc, I think, looks completely lost at the moment. He doesn't, in the wet he looked terrible. In the dry he looked kind of average. He looked like everybody else. He didn't look special at all today. And I think what's happened is that they've got a better rear and they've killed the front on the Ferrari, and that's killing the ability that Charles Leclerc can bring to the table to do something a bit different. He can just be an average racing driver. He'll do a really good job in race situations if he doesn't run into anybody on the first corner, but he's not the special Charles Leclerc that we can see sometimes when he's got a really good front end. And that's where Ferrari will now need to focus, I think, as they go to other circuits and they look at the development of the car. Red Bull, a big mystery for me. As you know, at the start of the year, I thought Red Bull would be in really good shape. I thought Max would be taking advantage of that 100%. Really impressed with Max today, the way his demeanor remained very, very solid, very even, the way he was speaking to the engineers, speaking to the team. He's obviously desperate to have a car with a lot more grip and a lot more balance through all the different types of corners, slow, medium and high speed. But whenever they tried to do something with the car, it went over the edge. It was either understeer, it was oversteer. They couldn't get a balance. Whatever it is, Adrian Newey is there looking very pensive. They can't get any sort of sweet spot in the car that enables them to allow Max to do what he does either, which is obviously something very special. We did see how much better he was doing with the car than Alex Albon. Albon had a badly managed qualifying, which is unusual for Red Bull. Badly managed, he says. We're not really sure. I mean, released into traffic, things like that. But that shouldn't account for Albon not making it through into Q3, which is incredible, really, for a Red Bull driver around Hungary. But that's what happened, and I think that's more a reflection of how difficult this car is to drive, and maybe in terms of Alex's mind, you know, he didn't have that shunt last year. Maybe that's there as well. And there aren't that many nice cops-like medium to high-speed corners for Alex to really show his ability either around Hungary. Both Renault drivers looked as if they kind of got the limit from the car. I think this showed up a little bit more Daniel Ricciardo's soft touch, his finesse, compared with Esteban Ocon, who was really having to lean on the car and do the perfect lap if he was going to get the lap time out of it. Daniel has a lot more, he's got a slightly larger palette with which to paint, And we saw that in Hungary. And that's why Daniel will be potentially, hopefully, in good shape in the race tomorrow. It could well be a race where tyre strategies come into it, grip levels change in Hungary a lot. The more laps you can do in a groove, obviously you're going to be in good shape in Hungary, but the tyres do go off quite quickly. As we saw in the F2 race, where there was a sort of Nigel Mansell 89 Ferrari type win for Robert Schwartzman. He was nowhere, qualified 11th, I think, but he took the strategy of running the medium tyre off the line as long as he could and then putting the soft tyre on at the end, and he just blitzed past everyone, including his teammate Mick Schumacher, to win the race from P11 on the grid. And Nikita Mazepin, who, interestingly enough, another Rob Wilson pupil. He's done a lot of work with Rob, I think was even lower on the grid, something like 14th, finished second with the same strategy. It would be interesting if that sort of race happens tomorrow. I don't think it will, because Mercedes have such an advantage. Racing Point could deliver that, but they are sufficiently high up for it not to be that interesting anyway. The main tussle, I think, will be between Ferrari and Red Bull. That'll be an interesting one to observe. Williams looked a lot better in Austria. Now they're cranking downforce on for Hungary. George Russell and Nicholas Latifi, both of them did a really good job. George particularly, just fabulous. There was a moment in Q1, the second part of Q1, when he went out for his last run in Q1, and he was like P4 or something, and everybody was just stunned. The track was getting quicker, but it was a great lap by George, a typical George Russell lap. And it's so nice to see how George has integrated himself, not only as a driver in the pit lane that everybody respects, but also as a driver, as an employee at Williams who gets the best out of everybody. He's doing a brilliant job at Williams. We should never underplay that. McLaren looked good. Again, Lando Norris slightly quicker than Carlos Sainz. Again, I think that too is a reflection of Lando's shorter corners, his ability to manipulate the car. Carlos is more of an oversteer driver, as I've been saying a lot recently, slightly longer corners, and that's why Lando got the advantage. Of course, it's not as simple as that. If you drive like Lando, you've still got to get the perfect lap. You've still got to do all that manipulation, and the McLaren around Hungary isn't probably quite as competitive relative to the others. Probably not as easy a car to drive with as big a sweet spot, but Lando still looked really, really good in that car, and he's a bit more comfortable in the cockpit too, which of course is very good for him. The Team Shambles Award, Dennis Jenkinson, DSJ in motorsport, sadly missed. The greatest of all journalists, Formula One journalists, won the Mille Miglia with Sterling Moss. Always used to have a Team Shambles Award at any given moment in Formula One, and usually it went to BRM in the latter years, but this time it's no longer with Williams. It's got to be around the Haas Alfa Romeo area of the grid. I mean, these two teams really struggling at the moment and not looking as if they are enjoying themselves in Formula One at all. A shout out too for Pierre Gasly, who I think did a really good job in the Alfa Toro, what used to be the Toro Rosso. It's not easy when all the limelight's somewhere else, but Pierre continuing to put in the good laps. It'll be interesting to see what sort of balance they can get out of that car in the race tomorrow.